The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished hulls of battle tanks at Fort Benning's Armor and Cavalry Museum. Colonel Frank Steele Abrams ran his weathered hand along the curved steel of an M4 Sherman tank. The metal felt cool against his palm, despite the Georgia heat already building outside the vast hangar. At 58, Frank still stood ramrod straight, his silver hair cropped in the same military cut he'd worn for nearly 4 decades. The morning light caught the remnants of desert sand permanently etched in the creases of his knuckles from years commanding tanks across Middle Eastern battlefields. This old girl saved more American lives than any piece of machinery in World War II, Frank said, his voice carrying across the quiet museum to the small group of veterans gathered around him. Men of his generation or older, wearing caps and jackets adorned with unit patches and campaign ribbons. Their eyes held the same knowing look Frank saw in his own reflection each morning. Men who understood the weight of decisions made inside steel hulls. Frank tapped the Sherman's armor. 30,000 of these rolled off American assembly lines. Detroit auto workers turned from making cars to cranking these out 24 hours a day. My father commanded one across France after D-Day. Said he could hear German shells pinging off the armor like hail on a tin roof. A white-haired man wearing a Desert Storm veteran cap nodded slowly. Different era. They don't make them like they used to, Colonel. Different challenges require different solutions, Jack, Frank replied, moving toward the massive M1 Abrams tank dominating the center of the exhibition hall. But some principles never change. Frank Abrams had been leading these tours monthly since retiring from active service 5 years ago. The Army brass had initially requested he stay on as a consultant, given his unmatched battlefield experience with armored warfare. But Frank had declined anything that kept him tied to a desk. Instead, he volunteered here, preserving the legacy of American armor for future generations while connecting with fellow veterans who spoke his language of hydraulics, ballistics, and brotherhood forged under fire. The small group moved toward the M1 Abrams, its imposing profile dwarfing the vintage vehicles surrounding it. Now this beauty, Frank said with unmistakable pride, shares my family name, though we're only distant relations to General Creighton Abrams. My great-grandfather served under Patton, just like the general did. 4 generations of Abrams men have commanded tanks since. It's in our blood. Frank climbed up with surprising agility for his age and popped open the commander's hatch. The familiar motion triggered memories that never faded. The smell of diesel and gun oil, the tactical chatter over comms, the bone-jarring advance across the Iraqi desert during Operation Desert Storm, the faces of men who never came home. 67 tons of American resolve, Frank continued, his voice momentarily distant as the memories washed over him. Depleted uranium armor, gas turbine engine that can push this beast to 45 miles per hour, the most lethal stabilized weapon system ever deployed on a main battle tank. He gestured toward the massive 120mm main gun. When this cannon fires, enemies of America meet their maker with stunning efficiency. One of the veterans chuckled. Tell them about Medina Ridge, Colonel. These youngsters need to hear the real stories. Frank's expression shifted subtly. The largest tank battle since World War II remained etched in his consciousness like it happened yesterday rather than 30 years ago. His tank company had engaged Republican Guard forces in Iraq, destroying 28 enemy tanks without losing a single American vehicle. Textbook victory that combat historians still studied at West Point. Another time, perhaps, Frank said, climbing down from the tank. Some memories remain too vivid to share casually. Let's move on to the Bradley fighting vehicle. As the tour continued, Frank's phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, noting the Pentagon prefix. Few people still called him from that number. His curiosity piqued, he excused himself momentarily from the group. Abrams, he answered, stepping into a quiet corner of the museum. Frank, it's Bill Harrison. The familiar voice of his old West Point classmate, now Lieutenant General William Harrison, carried an unusual tension. Wow. Bill, been a while. How's life behind the big desk treating you? Could use some of that desert air some days. Too many politicians, not enough soldiers. A heavy pause followed. Frank, I need your expertise officially. Frank's posture straightened instinctively. I'm retired, Bill. Happily so. This is different. The Thunderbolt program. Frank went silent. The M7 Thunderbolt represented the next generation of American armor, designed to counter emerging threats from peer adversaries. The program had been shrouded in secrecy for years. What about it? Frank asked cautiously. We're in trouble, Frank. Technical issues, political pressure, budget overruns, the usual Pentagon three-headed monster. But worse, I need someone I can trust to evaluate where we stand. Someone who knows tanks better than the engineers who designed them. There must be a dozen qualified officers in active service. None with your combat experience. None I trust implicitly. Harrison's voice lowered. The Secretary of Defense approved the request personally. We need the best, Frank. That's you. Frank glanced back at the veterans still examining the Bradley. Men who understood duty never really ended with retirement. His gaze drifted toward the American flag hanging in the museum's entryway. When do you need me? Tomorrow, Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Temporary reactivation to colonel rank with all clearances reinstated. Harrison sounded relieved. Thank you, Frank. Don't thank me yet. I call problems as I see them, always have. That's exactly why we need you. Transport details incoming to your email. See you at 0800. Frank ended the call and returned to the tour group, completing the museum circuit with practiced professionalism that betrayed none of his inner contemplation. As the veterans departed with handshakes and nods of mutual respect, Frank lingered in the massive hangar, alone with the machines that had defined his life. He approached the M1 Abrams again, placing his hand on its armor. His family legacy and personal history were intertwined with these vehicles. 4 generations of Abrams men had lived, fought, and sometimes died inside American tanks. The responsibility to get things right weighed heavily on his shoulders. The caretaker's keys jingled as he approached. Closing up soon, Colonel, unless you need more time. Frank shook his head. No, thank you, Jim. I've seen everything I needed to. That night, Frank sat on his porch overlooking the Georgia pines, nursing a glass of bourbon as cicadas orchestrated their evening symphony. His modest retirement home sat on 2 acres outside Columbus, close enough to Fort Benning to stay connected to Army life, but far enough to feel like a sanctuary. Photos of his tank crews through the years lined his study walls inside. Men who had trusted him with their lives. Men he'd lost despite his best efforts. Frank opened his laptop and studied the briefing materials Harrison had sent over. The M7 Thunderbolt project represented billions in development costs spanning nearly a decade. The stated goal was creating an armored fighting vehicle for the next 30 years of combat operations. The technical specifications were impressive on paper. Reduced crew size through automation, enhanced ballistic protection, network-centric warfare integration. But something in the material struck Frank as fundamentally wrong. The designs emphasized technology over survivability in ways that made his combat experience sound alarm bells. He'd seen what happened when theoretical capabilities met battlefield realities. His phone rang again, this time displaying his son's number. Frank answered immediately. Marcus, everything all right? Hey, Dad. The voice of Captain Marcus Abrams carried the familiar formality that had characterized their relationship since his mother's death 5 years ago. Just checking in. Thompson said he saw you giving a tour at the museum today. Last Tuesday of every month, like always, Frank replied, taking a sip of bourbon. How's life at Aberdeen? A pause. Busy, challenging, bureaucratic. How's retirement? Frank considered mentioning his Pentagon recall, but hesitated. Quiet. You know me, though, finding ways to stay useful. The awkward silence that followed spoke volumes about their strained relationship. Marcus had followed family tradition into the Army and Tank Corps, but had chosen engineering over combat command, designing the very weapons his father had once wielded in battle. Their professional paths rarely intersected, and personal connections had grown equally distant. Listen, Dad, I should go. Early morning tomorrow. Big demonstration for some Pentagon brass coming in. Frank realized with sudden clarity that his son likely worked on the very Thunderbolt program he was being called to evaluate. Marcus, about tomorrow. Really need to go, Dad. I'll call this weekend. The line went dead before Frank could respond. He set his phone down and stared into the darkness beyond his porch. Tomorrow would bring complications he hadn't anticipated. Dawn broke with military precision as Frank dressed in his Class A uniform, which still fit his trim frame perfectly. The taxi arrived at Borough 545 to transport him to the private airfield where a government jet waited. By 0730, he was touching down at Phillips Army Airfield, adjacent to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. A staff car awaited him, driven by a young sergeant who recognized Frank's reputation immediately. Honored to meet you, Colonel Abrams. Your Desert Storm tactics are still required reading at Fort Knox, sir. Frank nodded appreciatively. Good to hear they still teach the classics, Sergeant. The sprawling Aberdeen facility came into view, its massive test ranges and research facilities representing the heart of America's ground warfare development programs. As they approached the high-security Theoretical Warfare Center, Frank noticed the heightened security presence and collection of black government SUVs indicating the presence of senior leadership. Lieutenant General William Harrison greeted Frank at the entrance, his imposing 6'4" frame now carrying more weight around the middle than during their West Point days 4 decades earlier. His handshake remained crushing. Frank, damn good to see you. Harrison's professional demeanor cracked slightly as he embraced his old friend. Thanks for coming on such short notice. Still figuring out why I'm here, Bill. Harrison gestured toward the secure conference room. Full briefing in 5 minutes. But the short version, the Thunderbolt program is 18 months behind schedule, 20% over budget, and still failing fundamental operational requirements. Congress is asking questions. The Secretary is demanding answers. And I need someone who can't be bullshitted by contractors or intimidated by rank. Frank followed Harrison into a modern conference room where 8 people sat around a polished table. Frank recognized the nameplate for Global Defense Technologies, the primary contractor for many Army weapon systems. Their CEO, Richard Garner, was a former Pentagon procurement officer who had moved seamlessly into the private sector 10 years ago. Frank had crossed paths with him during his final years of service and found the man's priorities questionable. Ladies and gentlemen, Harrison announced, Colonel Frank Abrams joins us as Senior Technical Advisor and Operational Evaluator for the Thunderbolt program, effective immediately. He reports directly to me and has full access to all aspects of the program. Frank scanned the room, noting the range of expressions from cautious, welcome to open hostility. His gaze stopped when he recognized his son Marcus, sitting rigidly in his Army captain's uniform toward the far end of the table. The younger Abrams showed no reaction to his father's arrival beyond a slight tightening of his jaw. Harrison continued the introductions. Colonel Abrams commanded tank units in Operations Desert Storm, Iraqi Freedom, and multiple classified operations. He's forgotten more about armored warfare than most of us will ever know. Richard Garner rose, extending his hand with corporate smoothness. Colonel, GDT welcomes your expertise. We're confident you'll be impressed by the next-generation capabilities of the M7 Thunderbolt. Frank shook the offered hand without warmth. Looking forward to seeing actual performance, Mr. Garner. Papers and PowerPoints don't win wars. The CEO's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. As Frank took his seat, a woman across the table caught his attention. Elizabeth Liz Reeves, according to her nameplate. Something about her seemed familiar, though Frank couldn't immediately place her. Mid-50s, professionally dressed with streaks of gray in her dark hair, she studied Frank with unusual intensity. Harrison took control of the meeting. Colonel Abrams will spend the next 3 weeks conducting a comprehensive review of the Thunderbolt program. Technical specifications, design philosophy, manufacturing readiness, and most importantly, combat effectiveness. I expect complete cooperation from all program stakeholders. The morning proceeded with detailed briefings on the M7 Thunderbolt's capabilities. Reduced crew size from 4 to 3 through automated loading systems. Revolutionary composite armor. Integrated battlefield management systems that networked with drones and satellite intelligence. Advanced terrain adaptation suspension. The list of technological innovations was impressive. Frank remained silent throughout, taking detailed notes and occasionally glancing toward his son, who studiously avoided eye contact while providing technical data when called upon. After lunch, Harrison personally escorted Frank to the massive testing hangar, where the Thunderbolt prototype sat under bright lights. The tank's angular, futuristic profile represented a significant departure from traditional American tank design philosophy. What do you think? Harrison asked as technicians scurried around the vehicle preparing for afternoon demonstrations. Frank circled the machine slowly, examining every aspect of its construction with the practiced eye of someone who had depended on such machines for survival. Looks aren't everything. Fair enough. You'll see it in action this afternoon. As Harrison was called away to take a phone call, Frank continued his inspection, climbing onto the hull to examine the turret design more closely. The access points seemed unnecessarily complicated. The emergency escape hatches reduced in size to accommodate additional electronic systems. The chief designer prioritized sensor coverage over crew extraction protocols. Frank turned to find Elizabeth Reeves standing beside the tank, her expression professional, but with unmistakable undertones of disapproval. Ms. Reeves, you seem less enthusiastic than your colleagues. Dr. Reeves, she corrected without animosity. And I prefer engineering realities over marketing promises, Colonel. Frank climbed down from the tank, studying her more carefully. We've met before. She nodded slightly. Briefly, Kuwait City, 1991. My husband was Captain James Reeves, 2nd Armored Division. The name triggered immediate recognition. Jim Reeves, hell of an officer. He led one of the flanking companies during the Medina Ridge engagement. Yes. Her expression remained carefully neutral. He spoke highly of your tactical decisions that day. Frank sensed there was more to this interaction than professional courtesy. I'm sorry I didn't keep up with many officers after deployment. Did Jim make it to Pentagon like he planned? No. Her response came evenly. He was killed during a training exercise in Germany in '94. Ammunition fire in the turret, the safety systems failed. The revelation hit Frank harder than expected. Good officers lost to preventable mechanical failures represented his greatest professional nightmare. I didn't know. I'm truly sorry, Dr. Reeves. It was a long time ago, Colonel. She gestured toward the Thunderbolt. That's why I'm here, to ensure history doesn't repeat itself. Before Frank could respond, Richard Garner approached with an entourage of executives and military liaisons. Colonel Abrams, we're ready to begin the live fire demonstration. You're in for quite a show. Frank nodded to Reeves respectfully before following Garner toward the observation area. Something about her presence and connection to the past felt significant, though he couldn't yet determine how. The afternoon demonstration took place on Aberdeen's massive range complex. Frank watched from the observation bunker as the M7 Thunderbolt performed a series of mobility and firepower tests. The machine's capabilities were undeniably impressive on several fronts. The advanced fire control system engaged multiple targets with precision while moving at speed. The enhanced power plant delivered remarkable acceleration for a vehicle of its size. Yet Frank noted concerning issues immediately. The automated loading system jammed twice during rapid fire sequences. The computer targeting interface experienced lag when switching between thermal and optical targeting modes. Most worrisome, the crew compartment design sacrificed protection for technological integration in ways that made Frank profoundly uncomfortable. As the demonstration concluded, Frank remained in the observation bunker, reviewing his notes while others filed out. He sensed rather than heard someone approach, looking up to find his son Marcus standing awkwardly nearby. Captain, Frank acknowledged formally. Colonel, Marcus matched his father's professional tone. I wasn't informed you were joining the program. Last-minute decision, General Harrison requested my evaluation. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. You should have called. Didn't know you were assigned to Thunderbolt. Your specialty was propulsion systems, last I heard. I transferred to weapons integration 2 years ago. The unspoken accusation of paternal disinterest hung between them. Frank closed his notebook. The autoloader needs work. 2 failures in demonstration conditions means dozens in field operations. Marcus's professional demeanor cracked slightly. That's your first observation? Not the revolutionary targeting system or breakthrough mobility package. Those work as advertised. The autoloader doesn't, and it's positioned in a way that endangers the gunner if it catastrophically fails. Frank studied his son carefully. You know better than that, Marcus. We've made 7 design revisions addressing that exact concern. GDT overruled the final safety modifications. Cost and schedule priorities. Frustration edged into Marcus's voice. Some battles you don't win in development. Frank recognized the corporate compromise language immediately. Every battle matters when lives depend on the outcome. Marcus checked his watch. I have a meeting. There's a full technical review tomorrow at 0900. Will you be there? Wouldn't miss it. As Marcus turned to leave, Frank called after him. Your mother would be proud of your accomplishments, son. Marcus paused briefly, then continued walking without response. That evening, Frank found himself in the officers' quarters reviewing technical documents from the Thunderbolt program. The design compromises became increasingly apparent with each page. Theoretical capabilities prioritized over practical battlefield realities. Cost-cutting measures in critical safety systems. Schedule acceleration that bypassed thorough testing protocols. A knock at his door interrupted his reading. Frank opened it to find General Harrison holding a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses. Thought you might need this after today, Harrison said, entering without waiting for invitation. He poured 2 generous measures and handed one to Frank. Your unfiltered assessment, old friend, off the record. Frank accepted the bourbon. You've got serious problems, Bill. The Thunderbolt isn't combat ready. May never be with its current architecture. Harrison nodded grimly. That's what I suspected, but I needed someone of your stature to officially document it. Why me specifically? Harrison settled into a chair, suddenly looking every one of his 62 years. Because you're unimpeachable, Frank. Combat decorated, technically proficient, and completely unmotivated by political or career considerations. There's more to it. Harrison sipped his bourbon. GDT has remarkable political protection. 3 committee chairmen, 2 senior Pentagon officials, and a network of retired generals all carrying their water. Anyone currently serving who raises concerns finds their career stalled, or worse. And I'm already retired with nothing to lose, Frank concluded. Exactly. Plus your combat record makes you difficult to dismiss. Harrison leaned forward. The Thunderbolt program represents the future of American armored warfare. If we get this wrong, American soldiers die. It's that simple. My son works on the program. Harrison nodded. I know, that complicates things personally, but actually strengthens our position professionally. No one can claim nepotism when you're holding his work to higher standards. Frank set down his glass. What exactly are you asking me to do, Bill? Complete forensic analysis of the Thunderbolt. Identify every flaw, every compromise, every potential battlefield failure point. Document everything with irrefutable evidence. I'll handle the political fallout. GDT won't take this lying down. No, they won't. Harrison's expression hardened. Richard Garner has billions riding on this contract. He'll fight dirty when threatened. Frank considered the implications. Taking on a major defense contractor would make powerful enemies. Yet walking away from fundamental safety issues went against everything he believed about leadership responsibility. I'll need unrestricted access, all test data, all design specifications, all safety incident reports. Already arranged. Presidential level authorization. Harrison finished his bourbon. One more thing, Dr. Elizabeth Reeves. Jim Reeves' widow. I met her today. Harrison nodded. She's been raising concerns about crew protection systems for months, getting stonewalled at every turn. She requested your specific involvement when the secretary authorized an independent review. Frank raised an eyebrow. She asked for me by name. Said you were the only tank commander who ever put crew survival above mission completion in your tactical doctrine. Harrison stood to leave. Get some rest, Frank. Tomorrow we start turning over rocks. Won't be pretty what crawls out. After Harrison departed, Frank returned to the technical documents with renewed purpose. Around midnight, he discovered the first truly alarming design flaw. The Thunderbolt's ammunition storage configuration placed highly combustible materials dangerously close to crew positions, completely contrary to lessons learned from Operation Desert Storm. Frank documented the issue meticulously, then continued his review. By dawn, he had identified 7 critical safety concerns that could potentially result in catastrophic battlefield failures. Each represented a fundamental compromise of proven armored warfare principles in favor of technological advancement or cost reduction. Frank dressed in his uniform and headed toward the main facility, his concerns crystallizing into certainty. The Thunderbolt program needed major reconfiguration before any production authorization. As he crossed the compound, he spotted his son engaged in an intense conversation with Richard Garner near the test facility entrance. The CEO appeared to be lecturing rather than discussing, his finger jabbing toward Marcus's chest repeatedly. When Garner departed, Frank approached his son. Everything all right, Captain? Marcus straightened upon noticing his father. Fine, sir. Mr. Garner was expressing concerns about today's technical review. Seemed rather animated for professional concerns. Marcus hesitated, professional reserve warring with personal frustration. He suggested my familial connection might compromise objectivity in the review process. Your work should speak for itself. That's what I said. Marcus checked his watch. Review starts in 20 minutes. Engineering Lab 3. Frank nodded. I'll be there. The technical review assembled the core Thunderbolt development team in a secure laboratory space dominated by component displays and technical workstations. Frank took his position at the head of the conference table, arranging his notes methodically as team members filed in. He noticed Dr. Reeves entering with several binders of material, her expression suggesting she anticipated confrontation. General Harrison called the meeting to order with characteristic directness. Colonel Abrams has completed his initial review of the Thunderbolt program. This session will address preliminary findings and establish protocols for deeper evaluation. Colonel, the floor is yours. Frank stood, surveying the assembled team with the same evaluative gaze he'd once used before leading men into combat. The M7 Thunderbolt represents impressive technological advancement in several domains. However, my review has identified critical safety and operational concerns that must be addressed before this vehicle can be considered combat-ready. Richard Garner shifted forward. With all due respect, Colonel, you've had less than 24 hours to evaluate a program 10 years in development. Sometimes the most dangerous flaws are those hiding in plain sight, Mr. Garner. Frank activated the central display screen, bringing up schematics of the ammunition storage configuration. The primary ammunition compartment sits directly adjacent to the gunner's station without adequate blast shielding. Any penetration of the hull in this quadrant would result in catastrophic ammunition cooking off, with the crew having approximately 3 seconds to evacuate. Marcus spoke up. We submitted redesign proposals for isolated ammunition compartments with blowout panels similar to the M1A2 configuration. They were rejected due to weight and cost constraints. All eyes turned toward Garner, who maintained his corporate composure. Every design involves trade-offs, Colonel. The Thunderbolt's enhanced armor composition provides superior protection that offsets the theoretical vulnerability you're describing. Theoretical? DeReeves interjected, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. We have combat data from 3 wars demonstrating precisely this failure mode. There's nothing theoretical about crew members burning to death because we prioritize procurement budgets over proven safety measures. Frank continued methodically through his findings. The autoloader mechanism's position created unnecessary crew vulnerability. The reduced escape hatch dimensions failed to account for soldiers wearing full combat gear. The digital control systems lacked adequate manual backups for battlefield conditions where electronic warfare might compromise operations. With each point, the room's atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Frank noticed Marcus and several other engineers exchanging glances that confirmed his assessment had identified concerns they themselves had raised internally. Garner finally interrupted. Colonel Abrams, while we appreciate your combat experience, modern armored warfare has evolved significantly since your active service. The Thunderbolt's integrated systems approach represents the future of mechanized combat. The physics of high-explosive rounds striking armor hasn't changed, Garner, nor has human anatomy's vulnerability to flame and overpressure. Frank's voice carried the weight of battlefield authority no corporate executive could match. I've notified General Harrison that I cannot recommend proceeding with the current Thunderbolt configuration. The safety risks to American soldiers are unacceptable. The room erupted in conflicting responses. Several engineers appeared relieved that long-standing concerns had finally received official recognition. GDT executives conferred urgently in hushed tones. Marcus maintained rigid military composure, while Dr. Reeves subtly nodded approval. Garner rose, straightening his tailored suit. General Harrison, this is highly irregular. Colonel Abrams is inserting himself into a development process without understanding the full context of design decisions. We request his preliminary findings be set aside pending more thorough program review. Harrison remained impassive. Request denied. Colonel Abrams will continue his evaluation with expanded scope and authority. I've already briefed the Secretary on initial findings, and he shares our concerns. This will set the program back years, Garner protested. Cost hundreds of millions in redesign. America's adversaries are fielding next-generation tanks while we debate theoretical safety margins. Frank gathered his materials calmly. Better to debate safety now than write letters to parents explaining why their children came home in body bags, Mr. Garner. I've written too many of those letters already. As the meeting dispersed in controlled chaos, Frank noticed his son lingering near the technical displays. He approached once others had departed. You identified these issues months ago, didn't you? Frank asked quietly. Marcus nodded, military bearing momentarily replaced by genuine concern. The entire engineering team did. We were overruled repeatedly. Schedule and budget priorities took precedence. Why didn't you push harder? Your name carries weight. A flicker of frustration crossed Marcus's face. You think I didn't try? That I'd willingly compromise safety? GDT threatened to replace our entire team if we didn't align with program objectives. Most of these engineers have families, mortgages. They can't afford professional martyrdom. Frank studied his son with newfound respect. I never doubted your commitment, Marcus. just wondering why these issues weren't escalated through military channels. They were. Documentation disappeared. Concerns were minimized. Officers who persisted found themselves reassigned. Marcus lowered his voice. The system is more broken than you realize, Dad. The personal address, rather than military rank, signaled a subtle shift in their interaction. Frank placed a hand briefly on his son's shoulder. Then we fix it. Properly. As they exited the laboratory, Elizabeth Reeves approached with determined purpose. Colonel Abrams, do you have a moment? There's additional information you should review. Frank nodded to his son, who departed with a respectful sir that nonetheless carried undertones of their personal connection. Frank turned his attention to Dr. Reeves. Your assessment validated concerns my team has raised for 18 months, she said, handing him a secure tablet. This contains testing data that wasn't included in the official documentation provided to you, thermal loading tests that demonstrate exactly the ammunition cooking problem you identified. Frank accepted the tablet. How did you obtain this if it was excluded from official records? I maintained independent testing logs when it became clear certain results were being selectively omitted from program documentation. Her professional demeanor softened slightly. My husband died because of corner cutting and ammunition storage design, Colonel. I won't let that happen to another crew if I can prevent it. Frank studied her with newfound understanding. That's why you're here. Personal mission. Professional integrity and personal motivation aren't mutually exclusive, Colonel. She hesitated before continuing. James always said if he had to go to war, he'd want to serve under an Abrams. Said your kind understood that tanks protect men, not the other way around. The comment struck Frank with unexpected emotional force. Throughout his career, he'd prioritized his crew's survival while accomplishing missions that other commanders deemed too risky. His tactics had been studied at West Point, not just for their effectiveness, but for their emphasis on minimizing casualties through proper employment of armored assets. I'll review this material immediately, Dr. Reeves, and I'll ensure it receives proper consideration regardless of political or corporate pressure. Thank you, Colonel. She turned to leave, then paused. Your son fought hard for these safety modifications. He's more like you than either of you probably realize. As Frank watched her depart, he felt the weight of responsibility settling more firmly on his shoulders. This wasn't just about evaluating a weapons system anymore. It was about confronting a procurement process that had become dangerously compromised by financial incentives and political influence. More importantly, it was about protecting future soldiers who would entrust their lives to these machines, and perhaps reconnecting with his son in the process. That afternoon, Frank requested access to the Thunderbolt prototype for hands-on evaluation. He spent hours examining every aspect of the vehicle from a commander's perspective, crawling through access points, testing sight lines, evaluating crew ergonomics under combat conditions. Marcus joined him, providing technical explanations for design choices, while Frank assessed practical implications. The commander's situational awareness is compromised by these sensor housings, Frank noted, demonstrating the limited visibility from the command position. Combat experience shows direct visual confirmation remains essential, even with enhanced optics. Marcus nodded. He proposed alternative configurations, overruled for signature reduction priorities. As their evaluation continued, Frank noticed his son's engineering brilliance more clearly. Marcus understood the technical systems at a level Frank never had, yet shared his father's fundamental concern for the humans operating the machinery. Their professional interaction gradually thawed the personal distance between them. By evening, they had documented 23 specific modifications required to meet proper combat standards. Frank returned to his quarters to compile his findings, but found Richard Garner waiting outside his door. Colonel Abrams, I thought we might have a private conversation. Garner's corporate charm remained intact, but carried an undercurrent of tension. Mr. Garner, what can I do for you? I believe we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. GDT values your combat expertise tremendously. Garner smiled without warmth. In fact, we've been authorized to offer you a senior consulting position with our company once your evaluation concludes. Extremely generous compensation package, minimal travel requirements. Your experience would be invaluable to our development programs. Frank recognized the bribe attempt immediately. Interesting timing, Mr. Garner. Simply good business, Colonel. Your insights are clearly valuable. We'd prefer having them on our side of the table. My insights are already on the right side of the table, the side that keeps American soldiers alive. Garner's facade hardened slightly. Colonel, the Thunderbolt represents billions in development investment in future contracts, thousands of American bombs, national security priorities set at the highest levels. One officer's personal safety standards, however well-intentioned, shouldn't derail a program of this magnitude. Those personal standards come from recovering burned bodies from tank hulls, Mr. Garner. An experience I hope you never have. I understand your concern, I do. Garner's voice lowered confidentially. What if we implement, say, half your recommended safety modifications? The most critical ones, a reasonable compromise that keeps the program on schedule while addressing your primary concerns. Frank regarded the executive steadily. Safety isn't negotiable, Mr. Garner. Neither is my integrity. Good evening. Frank entered his quarters, leaving Garner in the hallway. The attempted bribery confirmed Harrison's warnings about GDT's tactics when threatened. Frank suspected this was merely their opening move. Later that night, unable to sleep, Frank walked the secure compound, processing the day's revelations while formulating his strategy for the coming conflict. He found himself near the main testing hangar, noticing lights still active inside despite the late hour. Entering quietly, he discovered his son working alone at a design station, surrounded by technical readouts and simulation models. "Little past working hours, Captain," Frank commented. Marcus looked up, momentarily startled. "Couldn't sleep, thought I might as well be productive." Frank approached, examining the redesigned ammunition compartment his son was modeling. "Good work. Proper isolation characteristics while maintaining combat load requirements. It's what we should have implemented from the beginning." Marcus ran a simulation showing blast containment effectiveness. Adds approximately 40,000 per unit to production costs. Statistically saves 22 crew lives over program deployment lifespan. Some would say you can't put a price on American lives. Some don't make procurement decisions. Marcus's voice carried years of frustration. The system doesn't reward safety innovation, Dad. It rewards schedule adherence and budget performance. Frank pulled up from the chair. Been that way since they ordered George Washington's cannons. Doesn't make it right. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the first comfortable quiet they'd shared in years. Finally, Marcus spoke again. "GDT approached you with a consulting offer, didn't they?" Frank raised an eyebrow. "Standard procedure? Anyone who raises significant concerns gets either the carrot or the stick. The carrot is usually a lucrative position that ensures silence. The stick," Marcus trailed off. "Professional retaliation?" Marcus nodded grimly. 3 engineers transferred after documenting autoloader failures. One officer's career effectively ended after pushing too hard on crew protection standards. "And you? What happened when you raised concerns?" Marcus stared at his redesigned model rather than meeting his father's eyes. "They brought up your reputation, suggested I might be pushing safety margins to unrealistic levels to live up to the family name rather than applying objective engineering standards." Frank felt a surge of anger at the manipulation of their complex relationship. "That's why Garner was talking to you this morning. Reminded me that my career trajectory depends on program success. Suggested your involvement represents conflict of interest rather than independent verification." Marcus finally looked up. "Asked if I had the courage to stand on my own achievements rather than hiding behind my father's reputation." The calculated psychological manipulation targeting their father-son dynamic infuriated Frank more than any direct threat could have. "You've never hidden behind my name, Marcus. If anything, you've worked twice as hard to prove yourself despite it. Mom always said we were too alike for our own good, stubborn, principled to a fault." The mention of Catherine Abrams brought a shared moment of melancholy. Her death from cancer 5 years earlier had left a void neither man had properly addressed, their grief manifesting as increased distance rather than mutual support. "She was right about most things," Frank acknowledged, "especially about you. She knew you'd make your own path. Was damn proud when you chose engineering over combat command. Said the world needed more Abrams men building things rather than blowing them up." Marcus smiled slightly at the memory. "I miss her clarity. She always saw the right path forward." "What would she tell us to do now?" Frank asked quietly. "Stand our ground, together." Marcus straightened with renewed determination. "GDT doesn't understand what they've done, picking a fight with 2 Abrams men simultaneously." Frank felt an unfamiliar swelling of paternal pride. His son had developed the same unyielding integrity that characterized the Abrams military tradition, merely expressing it through different professional channels. "We'll need evidence they can't bury or discredit," Frank said, shifting to tactical planning. Harrison can provide political cover temporarily, but GDT has deep connections in Washington. Dr. Reeves has been documenting everything, testing anomalies, rejected safety proposals, even meeting minutes where concerns were raised and dismissed. Marcus lowered his voice. She's been building a case for years, has sources inside GDT feeding her information. Personal stake in the outcome, her husband. Marcus nodded. She believes his death wasn't just a random mechanical failure. That systematic safety compromises in the program he was testing directly contributed to the ammunition fire that killed him. The revelation added another dimension to the conflict unfolding around the Thunderbolt program. Not just current safety concerns, but potentially corporate liability for past incidents that had been classified as accidents. We'll need more than documentation, Frank mused. Need to demonstrate failure modes physically. Controlled testing that can't be disputed or reinterpreted. GDT controls all testing protocols. They determine what scenarios are evaluated and how results are measured. Frank considered the challenge. Then we change the testing parameters. Go outside standard protocols. That would require general officer authorization and significant risk to the prototype. Leave Harrison to me. You gather everything Reeves has documented. We're going to run a realistic combat simulation on this machine. No corporate parameters, no artificial constraints. Real-world conditions that show exactly how these design compromises would perform under enemy fire. Marcus studied his father with newfound respect. They'll fight this with everything they have. Let them. Frank stood, military bearing fully evident despite his civilian status. They're about to learn what Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard discovered in '91. You don't win tank battles against an Abrams. The technical lighting of the hangar cast stark shadows across their determined faces as father and son united in common purpose for the first time in decades. The battle for the Thunderbolt's future had just begun, and with it, a chance to repair their own damaged relationship while protecting future American soldiers from preventable harm. Frank extended his hand formally. I'm going to need a senior technical advisor for this evaluation, Captain. Someone who knows both the engineering specifications and operational implications. Interested? Marcus stood, accepting his father's handshake with military precision that barely concealed the emotional significance of the moment. Absolutely, Colonel. It would be an honor. Morning light filtered through the high windows of Aberdeen's secure conference room as Frank Abrams spread documents across the polished table. Photographs of tank damage patterns from Desert Storm, ammunition compartment schematics from 3 generations of American armor, combat after-action reports highlighting survivability factors in armored engagements, the visual chronicle of 40 years of lessons written in American blood and steel. General Harrison entered, coffee in hand, surveying Frank's methodical preparation. Building your case the old-school way, I see. Digital presentations can be manipulated, Frank replied without looking up. These can't. Harrison nodded appreciatively. The Secretary's office called this morning. GDT's lobbyists are already working congressional channels claiming program delays will create national security vulnerabilities. Expected. Frank positioned a particularly graphic photograph showing catastrophic ammunition cooking inside a tank turret. Let them explain how dead American soldiers enhance national security. You realize they'll try to discredit you personally before addressing technical concerns? Frank finally looked up, his expression unchanged. Wouldn't be the first time I've been shot at, Bill. The general placed a folder on the table. Authorization for your modified testing protocol, full combat simulation with realistic battle damage assessment, scheduled for next Tuesday. Frank reviewed the document with surprise. How did you push this through so quickly? The secretary served in Desert Storm, lost friends to equipment failures. Harrison's voice lowered. This isn't just about contracts to him, it's personal. As Harrison departed, Dr. Elizabeth Reeves arrived carrying several technical binders. Her professional composure remained intact, but Frank detected underlying tension in her movements. Colonel, I've compiled the documentation you requested. She placed the materials beside Frank's photographs. Complete testing anomaly reports for the past 18 months, including incidents that were classified as non-critical despite clear safety implications. Frank studied her carefully. You've taken significant professional risk collecting this. As I said yesterday, some motivations are both professional and personal. She hesitated briefly. They're monitoring us, you know. GDT has security personnel tracking everyone involved in your review. Noted, but not concerning. Reeves opened one of her binders, revealing a detailed schematic of the Thunderbolt's ammunition storage system. This is the current configuration that you identified as problematic. Nearly identical to the system that killed my husband in Germany. Different contractor, same fundamental design flaw. Frank examined the technical drawings. You're certain the failure modes are comparable? The physics of ammunition combustion don't change, Colonel. When primary charges detonate in confined spaces adjacent to crew compartments, the results are predictable. Her professional detachment momentarily slipped, and catastrophic. Their discussion was interrupted as Richard Garner entered with two military officers Frank didn't recognize. The GDT executive's corporate confidence appeared undiminished despite yesterday's confrontation. Colonel Abrams, I see you're continuing your evaluation. His gaze shifted to Reeves and the materials spread across the table. Though perhaps with somewhat selective technical input, Frank straightened to his full height. My door is open to all program stakeholders, Mr. Garner, including GDT representatives. Excellent. Garner gestured to his companions. Allow me to introduce Colonel James Wilson, Army Materiel Command, and Major Robert Chen, Pentagon Acquisitions Office. They've been assigned to provide oversight for your evaluation process. The implied monitoring was obvious. Frank shook hands with both officers, noting their carefully neutral expressions. Gentlemen, your expertise will be valuable. I assume you both have significant armored warfare experience? Wilson cleared his throat. I've overseen 3 major acquisition programs for tracked vehicles. And your combat deployments? An uncomfortable silence followed. Neither officer had seen actual combat. Frank nodded without comment, the distinction established without direct challenge. We'll be observing your methodology and ensuring proper procurement protocols are maintained, Wilson continued. The Thunderbolt represents a significant national investment. Indeed it does. Frank returned to his materials. I'll be conducting interviews with the engineering team this morning. You're welcome to observe. Garner remained after the officers departed. Colonel, I hope yesterday's conversation didn't create misunderstanding. GDT values your input tremendously. No misunderstanding, Mr. Garner. Your position was perfectly clear. Good. The executive's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Because while we respect your expertise, this program has timelines and contractual obligations that supersede individual concerns, however well-intentioned. Frank met the corporate executive's gaze directly. My only obligation is to the soldiers who will fight and potentially die in these vehicles, an obligation I take quite seriously. As do we all, Garner replied smoothly. I simply hope we can find constructive paths forward rather than adversarial positions for everyone's benefit. After Garner departed, Reeves exhaled audibly. They're escalating faster than I anticipated. Military oversight means they're worried. Good, Frank replied, returning to his review. Worried people make mistakes. Throughout the morning, Frank interviewed Thunderbolt engineers individually, building a comprehensive understanding of the program's evolution and compromise points. Most spoke carefully, aware of career implications, but provided critical insights when questions were properly framed. By noon, Frank had identified 17 specific design decisions where safety had been subordinated to cost, schedule, or performance metrics. The pattern confirmed his initial assessment of systematic prioritization of corporate interests over combat readiness. He was reviewing his notes when Marcus entered the conference room, carrying additional technical materials. You requested the original design concepts from initial development, Marcus said formally, aware they were likely being monitored. These show the evolution of crew protection systems from concept to current configuration. Frank accepted the documents. Thank you, Captain. Your assistance is valuable. As they examined the materials together, Marcus spoke quietly. Garner called an emergency meeting with the engineering team this morning, made it clear that cooperation with your excessive safety review would be noted in performance evaluations. Intimidation tactics. Standard procedure when challenged. Marcus indicated a particular design schematic. This was our original crew compartment configuration. Note the isolated ammunition storage and enhanced blast channeling, components that disappeared in later revisions. Frank studied the drawings with growing concern. The original design had incorporated nearly every safety feature he'd recommended in his preliminary assessment. The evolution away from those protections represented deliberate choices rather than oversight. Who authorized these revisions? Frank asked. Official documentation shows military requirement changes driving the modifications. Marcus's expression revealed the falsehood. Unofficially, GDT's program managers directed the changes to reduce production costs and accelerate timelines. Their discussion was interrupted by General Harrison's aide requesting Frank's immediate presence. Frank followed the young lieutenant to Harrison's office, finding the general in conversation with a senator on secure video conference. Harrison ended the call as Frank entered. That was Senator Malcolm Jenkins, Armed Services Committee. Harrison's expression was grim. GDT has accelerated their congressional pressure. Jenkins is questioning the necessity and authority of our review process. Political interference in technical evaluation. Predictable. It gets worse. The committee is considering emergency hearings on procurement obstruction by military personnel. They're painting this as resistance to modernization by old guard officers. Frank absorbed the information calmly. They're trying to run out the clock, create enough political pressure to force program approval before safety issues can be fully documented. Exactly. Harrison paced his office. Jenkins controls military appropriations, has 3 GDT manufacturing facilities in his state. The connection isn't subtle. How much time do we have? A week. Maybe less before this escalates beyond my ability to shield the review process. Harrison stopped pacing. Your modified testing protocol becomes essential. We need irrefutable evidence of design flaws that even political allies can't ignore. Frank considered their position strategically, as he would a battlefield scenario. We accelerate our timeline, consolidate documentation immediately, conduct the combat simulation testing within 72 hours instead of next week. GDT will object strenuously. Let them. Makes them appear more concerned with process than safety. Frank outlined his approach. We need one news outlet briefed on background, creates public awareness that makes it harder to bury the results regardless of outcome. Harrison nodded slowly. Risky but necessary. I'll authorize the accelerated testing schedule and arrange appropriate media awareness. As Frank departed, he found Richard Garner waiting in the antechamber with Colonel Wilson. Their presence confirmed GDT's intelligence network extended throughout the facility. Colonel Abrams, Garner greeted with manufactured cordiality. I understand you're requesting accelerated testing protocols outside standard evaluation parameters. Frank maintained his professional composure. Merely adjusting timelines to address critical safety concerns efficiently. I'd think GDT would welcome expedited resolution. Process matters in weapon development, Colonel, particularly when billions in taxpayer investment are at stake. Garner's corporate veneer thinned slightly. Rush testing based on preconceived biases risks damaging an essential national security program. Nothing preconceived about proper crew protection, Mr. Garner. Standard doctrine since tanks were invented. Frank moved to depart, but Garner stepped into his path. Colonel, I must insist that any testing follow established protocols approved by all stakeholders, including GDT as prime contractor. The executive's voice hardened. Otherwise, we'll be forced to challenge the validity of results through appropriate channels. Frank regarded him steadily. You mean political channels? I mean appropriate procedural remedies for irregular evaluation practices. Garner smiled without warmth. We're simply ensuring proper governance of a vital defense program. Frank stepped right around him. Governance noted, Mr. Garner. Testing proceeds on accelerated schedule regardless. The confrontation confirmed what Frank had suspected. GDT would attempt to invalidate any negative findings through procedural challenges rather than addressing substantive safety concerns. Political leverage would be deployed to override technical objections regardless of merit. He needed incontrovertible evidence that not even political allies could dismiss. And he needed to secure it before GDT could fully mobilize their considerable resources to obstruct the evaluation. Frank returned to the conference room where Marcus and Dr. Reeves continued analyzing technical documentation. Both recognized the determination in his expression immediately. Testing schedule accelerated to Friday morning, Frank announced. Combat simulation protocols with live fire testing of key vulnerability points. Marcus straightened with concern. That's barely 48 hours of preparation time. Exactly why GDT can't fully prepare countermeasures. Frank turned to Reeves. I need comprehensive documentation of every safety test anomaly, particularly ammunition storage and autoloader failures. Categorized and annotated by tomorrow morning. She nodded with professional determination. Already in progress. Marcus, I need simulation parameters that accurately model the most likely combat damage scenarios based on current threat weapon systems, particularly those targeting the vulnerability points we've identified. I'll coordinate with Aberdeen's ballistics team immediately. Marcus hesitated. GDT will attempt to influence the testing protocols to minimize exposure of known weaknesses. Expected, which is why we're going to design multiple test scenarios but not reveal which will be implemented until the actual demonstration. Frank outlined his strategy. They can't prepare for every contingency with only 48 hours' notice. As Marcus and Reeves departed to execute their assignments, Frank felt the familiar tension that preceded combat operations. The stakes weren't measured in territory or strategic objectives, but in the lives of future soldiers who would depend on these machines in battle. By evening, the facility buzzed with activity as the accelerated testing schedule disrupted normal operations. Frank worked methodically in the conference room, now transformed into an operations center for the evaluation team. Maps of the test range covered one wall, technical schematics another, and personnel assignments a third. The organizational approach mirrored combat planning methodology Frank had employed throughout his career. A knock at the door revealed Jack Murphy, the former tank sergeant Frank had mentioned during their museum tour. His weathered face broke into a grin beneath his Desert Storm veteran cap. "Heard you were stirring up trouble again, Colonel," Murphy said as they shook hands. "Figured you might need someone who knows how tanks actually work in the field." Frank smiled for the first time in days. "How did you get clearance to be here, Sergeant?" "General Harrison pulled some strings. Said you needed practical tankers, not just engineers and bureaucrats." Murphy surveyed the operations center with approval. "Planning for war, I see." "Corporate war this time," Frank replied, "but the principles apply." Murphy examined the test range layout. "Word is GDT is trying to shut down your evaluation before you can prove their fancy new tank is a death trap." "Something like that. They've got political protection and deep pockets. But they haven't commanded tanks in combat," Murphy stated with the confidence of a veteran non-commissioned officer. "You have. Makes all the difference." Frank briefed Murphy on the situation, the sergeant's practical experience adding valuable perspective to the technical analysis. As a former tank gunner with multiple combat deployments, Murphy understood intuitively the real-world implications of design compromises that looked acceptable on engineering diagrams. "This autoloader configuration is asking for trouble," Murphy observed, examining the Thunderbolt schematics. "Mechanical failure in combat conditions would require crew exposure to clear jams. Under fire, that's potentially fatal." "Exactly the kind of practical assessment we need," Frank agreed. "I want you to participate in Friday's testing. Provide the gunner's perspective on operability under combat stress." Their planning continued late into the night, interrupted only when Richard Garner arrived unannounced with Colonel Wilson and two corporate attorneys. The GDT executive's expression conveyed controlled anger beneath his professional demeanor. "Colonel Abrams, this accelerated testing schedule constitutes breach of evaluation protocols and potentially violates our contractual rights as prime contractor." Garner presented a legal document. "We've filed formal objection with the Secretary of Defense and requested immediate suspension of your authority pending review." Frank accepted the document without reaction. "Noted, Mr. Garner. Testing proceeds as scheduled until directed otherwise by appropriate command authority." "This isn't a battlefield where you can simply issue orders, Colonel." Garner's corporate restraint slipped slightly. "There are procedures and contractual obligations that govern defense acquisitions. GDT has legal rights in this process." "Rights documented and considered," Frank replied evenly. "Safety evaluation continues regardless." After a tense standoff, the GDT contingent departed, leaving Frank and Murphy in the operations center. "Corporate types," Murphy observed, "always thinking paperwork trumps reality." Frank reviewed Garner's illegal filing, recognizing the desperation behind the aggressive tactics. "They're scared, Jack. Means we're on the right track." The following morning brought renewed intensity as testing preparations accelerated. Frank arrived at the facility before dawn, finding Marcus already at work, finalizing simulation parameters. The captain acknowledged his father with respectful professionalism that nonetheless carried undertones of their improved relationship. "Ballistics team confirmed test configurations for 3 primary vulnerability scenarios," Marcus reported. "Ammunition compartment penetration, autoloader mechanical failure under battle damage, and electronic systems degradation during simulated combat operations." Frank reviewed the testing protocols. "Excellent work, comprehensive and defensible methodologically." "GDT representatives have been attempting to access the test parameters all night," Marcus added. "I've maintained security protocols per your instructions." Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Reeves arriving with concerning news. Colonel GDT has flown in 3 retired generals as independent evaluators to observe and potentially challenge your testing methodology. Frank absorbed this information calmly. Expected escalation. Names? Generals Phillips, Woodward, and Taylor. All served on defense industry boards after retirement. All with GDT connections. The deployment of retired flag officers represented classic industry tactics when facing serious program challenges. Former generals carried credibility that could counterbalance technical concerns through appeal to authority rather than engineering principles. Doesn't change our approach, Frank decided. We proceed with objective evaluation regardless of observers. As they continued preparations, General Harrison arrived with more troubling developments. Congressional pressure increasing. Senator Jenkins has scheduled oversight hearings for Monday. GDT has requested emergency contract review, claiming prejudicial evaluation practices threatening national security interests. Frank recognized the coordinated pressure campaign designed to forestall negative findings before they could be officially documented. Their timeline confirms our approach. They're trying to run out the clock before we can complete proper safety evaluation. There's more, Harrison continued grimly. Someone leaked your service record highlighting your disagreements with previous weapons procurement decisions. They're building a narrative that you're biased against modernization efforts. Murphy snorted derisively. Colonel Abrams wrote the book on modern armored warfare doctrine. That's desperation talking. Frank remained focused on their primary objective. Personal attacks were inevitable. Changes nothing about design flaws in the Thunderbolt. The remainder of the day passed in methodical preparation, the evaluation team working with practiced efficiency despite growing external pressure. By evening, 3 distinct test scenarios were fully developed, each designed to demonstrate critical safety vulnerabilities under realistic combat conditions. Frank reviewed final preparations with his core team as darkness fell over the Aberdeen facility. Marcus, Reeves, and Murphy represented the essential perspectives needed for comprehensive evaluation. Engineering expertise, technical documentation, and practical combat experience combined to create an assessment team GDT couldn't easily dismiss. Tomorrow's testing will likely determine the program's future, Frank explained. GDT will challenge methodology, dispute findings, and attempt to discredit results regardless of outcome. Our responsibility is creating an irrefutable record of safety concerns that cannot be dismissed through political or procedural maneuvering. Marcus nodded with determination. The testing protocols are scientifically sound and combat realistic. If vulnerabilities exist, they will be demonstrated conclusively. Documentation systems are in place, Reeves confirmed. Multiple recording angles, independent data collection, and secure transmission to oversight authorities. No single point of failure or manipulation. Murphy's contribution was characteristically direct. We're ready to show exactly how these design flaws would kill American soldiers in actual combat. No corporate lawyer can argue with physics and high explosives. As the meeting concluded, Frank found himself alone with his son. The professional formality that had characterized their interactions gradually softened as testing preparations solidified their working relationship. You've done exceptional work under extreme pressure, Marcus, Frank acknowledged. Your mother would be proud. Marcus seemed momentarily surprised by the personal comment. Just doing my job. No, you're doing what's right despite significant career risk. That goes beyond duty. Frank regarded his son with newfound respect. The Abrams tradition of integrity continues, just through different channels than tanks and combat commands. Something in Frank's tone resonated with Marcus, bridging years of distance between them. I learned from your example even when we disagreed on methods, standing ground when principles matter, not backing down under pressure. Tomorrow will bring considerable pressure, Frank cautioned. GDT has billions in contracts at stake. They'll deploy every resource available to protect those interests. Let them. Marcus displayed the same determination Frank recognized from his own military career. We have something they don't. What's that? The truth, and family tradition of not retreating under fire. Their moment of connection was interrupted by an urgent call from General Harrison. Frank answered immediately, hearing tension in his old friend's voice. Frank, we have complications. The Deputy Secretary of Defense has ordered postponement of tomorrow's testing pending procedural review of evaluation parameters. Frank processed this setback with combat leaders' discipline. Political interference as expected. Your assessment? GDT's congressional allies applied pressure at the highest levels, claiming potential damage to a strategic national asset without proper testing protocols. Our response? Harrison's tone shifted from official to personal. Officially, we comply with civilian authority while appealing through proper channels. Unofficially, the Secretary has authorized continuation of preliminary systems verification that doesn't constitute formal testing, but accomplishes similar objectives. Frank understood immediately. Semantic reclassification to bypass political obstruction. Preliminary systems verification proceeds at 0800 tomorrow as scheduled. Full documentation protocols maintained. After ending the call, Frank explained the situation to Marcus. Administrative obstruction attempting to delay conclusive evaluation. We adjust terminology without changing substance. Marcus nodded with newfound appreciation for battlefield adaptation applied to bureaucratic warfare. They're fighting harder than I expected. Makes me more certain we've identified critical vulnerabilities they can't address. Precisely. Frank checked his watch. Get some rest. Tomorrow determines whether American soldiers get properly protected tanks or profit-maximized death traps. As Frank returned to his quarters that evening, he found Richard Garner waiting in the parking area, alone for the first time without corporate or military escorts. The executive's demeanor had shifted from corporate confidence to controlled anger. Colonel, this personal vendetta against the Thunderbolt program has gone beyond professional disagreement into deliberate sabotage of national security interests. Garner's corporate veneer had cracked, revealing the ruthless operator beneath. Do you have any conception of what's actually at stake here? Frank regarded him calmly. American lives, Mr. Garner, as they have been throughout this evaluation. Billions in defense contracts, thousands of manufacturing jobs, America's competitive position against Chinese and Russian armor development. Garner stepped closer, lowering his voice. And yes, GDT's market position in my personal professional future. I'm being direct since you seem to appreciate that approach. Appreciate the honesty, if not the priorities, Frank replied evenly. I've reviewed your service record thoroughly, Colonel, distinguished but not without controversy. Your repeated challenges to procurement decisions throughout your career suggest a pattern rather than objective evaluation. Garner shifted to implicit threat. Patterns that congressional oversight committees might find concerning when examining your current conclusions. Frank remained unmoved. My record shows consistent prioritization of soldiers' survival over program expediency, a pattern I'm quite comfortable defending in any forum. This isn't a battlefield where strength of will determines outcomes, Garner insisted. It's a complex governmental process with multiple stakeholders and competing priorities. Your black and white approach isn't suitable for this environment. Funny thing about combat, Mr. Garner, when armor fails and ammunition cooks off inside a turret, the results are indeed quite black and white. Frank turned to leave but delivered a parting message. Tomorrow's evaluation proceeds regardless of administrative classification. I suggest you prepare your engineering team for objective results rather than political obstruction. Frank departed, leaving Garner standing alone in the darkened parking area. The confrontation confirmed the executive's growing desperation as testing approached. Corporate tactics that succeeded in boardrooms and congressional offices held little power against combat veterans executing mission-essential evaluations. Dawn broke clear and cold over Aberdeen Proving Ground as Frank arrived at the massive test range complex. Military police had established enhanced security perimeters overnight, checking credentials rigorously as personnel arrived. Frank noted the presence of 3 black SUVs with government plates indicating VIP observers had arrived for the demonstrations. Inside the Range Control Center, Frank found General Harrison conferring with several officers, including the newly arrived independent evaluators GDT had deployed. 3 retired generals in civilian business attire stood reviewing test parameters with expressions of professional skepticism. Harrison made introductions with military formality. Colonel Abrams, you know General Phillips, General Woodward, and General Taylor. They've joined us as technical observers for today's systems verification activities. Frank acknowledged each with appropriate courtesy while assessing their likely alignment with GDT interests. All 3 had transitioned to defense industry positions after retirement, the revolving door between military leadership and corporate defense contractors operating with predictable efficiency. Gentlemen, your experience will be valuable in today's evaluation, Frank stated diplomatically. General Woodward, silver-haired and imposing even in civilian attire, responded with carefully measured challenge. Colonel Abrams, we've reviewed your preliminary findings and testing protocols. There appears to be unusual emphasis on theoretical vulnerability scenarios rather than proven performance capabilities. Nothing theoretical about ammunition fires in crew compartments, General, Frank replied evenly. As combat veterans, I'm certain we share concern for realistic survivability assessment rather than optimal performance under controlled conditions. The implied reference to their shared combat experience created momentary discomfort, as none of the retired generals had commanded tanks in actual combat operations despite their senior ranks. The distinction established, Frank proceeded with professional courtesy. Today's evaluation focuses on 3 critical safety systems under combat realistic conditions. Methodologies follow established Army testing protocols with enhanced documentation to ensure objective assessment. As Frank briefed the overall testing approach, he observed Richard Garner entering with Colonel Wilson and several corporate executives. Their expressions suggested continuing confidence in political intervention rather than technical resolution. Marcus arrived shortly thereafter, accompanied by Dr. Reeves and the Aberdeen technical team. The testing crew had prepared throughout the night, positioning instrumentation, calibrating measurement systems, and establishing multiple documentation platforms to create irrefutable records regardless of outcome. Frank gathered his core team for final coordination before proceedings began. Regardless of administrative classification, today's evaluation will establish definitive safety assessment of the Thunderbolt. GDT will challenge methodology, dispute findings, and attempt to discredit results. Our responsibility is creating an objective record that stands on technical merit regardless of political pressure. The evaluation began promptly at 0800 with the Thunderbolt prototype positioned at the center of the massive range complex. High-speed cameras, thermal imaging systems, and pressure sensors surrounded the vehicle, creating comprehensive documentation capabilities beyond standard testing protocols. Frank addressed the assembled observers from the control center. Today's systems verification examines 3 critical safety components under combat realistic conditions. First, ammunition storage configuration under penetration scenarios. Second, autoloader functionality during simulated battle damage. Third, crew survivability during catastrophic system failures. The technical team initiated the first test sequence, using shaped charges to simulate enemy and anti-tank munitions, striking the Thunderbolt's hull precisely where vulnerability analysis had indicated highest risk to ammunition storage systems. The controlled detonation created combat-realistic damage to evaluate containment capabilities and crew compartment protection. High-speed cameras captured the subsequent chain reaction in microscopic detail. Primary penetration breached the inadequately protected ammunition storage exactly as Frank had predicted in his initial assessment. Secondary explosions cascaded through adjacent compartments, pressure waves channeling directly into crew positions rather than being diverted through blast channels as proper design would ensure. The damage assessment team approached cautiously after range safety officers confirmed testing area security. Marcus led the technical documentation, recording every aspect of the failure sequence with methodical precision. Primary containment failure complete at 2.3 seconds post-impact, Marcus reported. Crew compartment overpressure exceeding survivability threshold by approximately 300%. Thermal conditions consistent with fatal burn injuries to all crew positions. Frank observed Richard Garner conferring urgently with the retired generals, their expressions shifting from professional skepticism to genuine concern as damage assessment continued. The objective evidence was proving more compelling than anticipated. The second test sequence evaluated the autoloader system under battlefield conditions. Simulated mechanical stress combined with electronic system degradation to create realistic combat damage scenarios. The autoloader jammed catastrophically as predicted, with clearing procedures requiring crew exposure to unacceptable risk under combat conditions. Sergeant Murphy provided practical combat perspective during assessment. Jam clearance would require gunner to expose upper body outside protective armor for minimum 20 seconds. Under enemy fire, that's effectively a death sentence. By mid-morning, 2 critical safety systems had demonstrated catastrophic failure under combat realistic conditions. The objective evidence was accumulating beyond GDT's ability to dismiss through procedural challenges or political intervention. Frank gathered his evaluation team during the brief testing pause before the final sequence. Documentation secure and transmitted? Reeves nodded. Multiple redundant systems. Complete data packages transmitted to Secretary's office, Congressional Oversight Committee, and secure military archives. No single point of failure or manipulation. GDT is already attempting to challenge test parameters as unrealistic, Marcus reported, claiming penetration scenarios exceed probable battlefield conditions. Murphy snorted derisively. Tell that to my gunner who took RPG fragments through thinner armor in Fallujah. These tests are exactly what happens in actual combat. The final test sequence examined electronic systems vulnerability under battlefield conditions. Modern tanks depended increasingly on integrated digital systems for everything from targeting to basic mobility. The Thunderbolt design had sacrificed traditional mechanical backup systems for weight and cost reduction. The simulation demonstrated conclusively that electronic warfare countermeasures could potentially render the vehicle combat ineffective without proper redundant systems. More concerning, critical safety functions, including fire suppression and emergency hatches, relied on electronic controls vulnerable to battlefield damage. As testing concluded, Frank observed the shifting dynamics among observers. The retired generals had separated physically from GDT representatives, their military professionalism apparently reasserting dominance over corporate affiliations as objective evidence accumulated. Richard Garner appeared increasingly isolated, his expression transitioning from confident corporate executive to embattled defender of increasingly indefensible design decisions. His urgent phone conversations suggested escalating concerns at GDT headquarters as testing results proved worse than anticipated. Frank conducted the post-testing briefing with characteristic thoroughness. Each failure mode was documented meticulously with direct connections to design decisions that prioritize cost, schedule, or performance metrics over crew survivability. In conclusion, 3 critical safety systems demonstrate catastrophic failure modes under combat realistic conditions, Frank summarized. Each represents unacceptable risk to American soldiers that must be addressed before this vehicle can be considered combat ready. General Woodward, the most senior of the retired officers GDT had deployed, spoke with unexpected candor. Colonel Abrams, while I initially questioned your testing methodology, the results appear conclusive regarding crew survivability concerns. What modifications would you consider essential before program continuation? The question represented significant shift from expected corporate alignment to professional military assessment. Frank outlined 17 specific design modifications addressing the identified vulnerabilities, each technically feasible within program parameters, though requiring schedule adjustments and cost increases. Implementation of these modifications would restore proper crew protection without compromising essential performance capabilities, Frank concluded. American soldiers deserve nothing less. As the briefing concluded, Richard Garner made one final attempt to control the narrative. While today's demonstration identified potential improvement opportunities, the fundamental Thunderbolt design remains sound for intended mission parameters. GDT remains confident in our ability to address any concerns while maintaining program timelines. The statement received noticeably limited support from previously aligned participants. Even Colonel Wilson, ostensibly deployed to provide oversight favorable to GDT interests, remained silent rather than endorsing Garner's position. General Harrison concluded proceedings with appropriate military formality. Complete testing documentation will be provided to all program stakeholders for comprehensive review. Formal recommendations regarding program continuation will follow established protocols through proper channels. As participants dispersed, Frank found himself approached by General Woodward away from corporate representatives. The retired general's expression suggested professional reassessment rather than continued corporate alignment. Impressive evaluation, Colonel. Methodologically sound and objectively documented. Woodward lowered his voice. I accepted this observation role, believing concerns were exaggerated. The evidence suggests otherwise. Frank acknowledged the professional courtesy. Appreciate your objective assessment, General. My report will reflect technical findings rather than program advocacy, Woodward continued. Some relationships are worth sacrificing when soldier lives are at stake. The comment represented significant shift from expected corporate alignment, suggesting GDT's strategy of deploying retired generals as counter-influence had backfired when confronted with irrefutable safety evidence. Frank located Marcus supervising final documentation activities. his son's engineering expertise having proven invaluable throughout testing. Their professional collaboration had gradually restored personal connection damaged through years of distance. Outstanding work today, Frank acknowledged. Your technical direction was essential to conclusive demonstration. Marcus nodded with professional satisfaction, transitioning to personal pride. We established irrefutable evidence. Even GDT's political protection can't easily dismiss these results. The fight isn't over, Frank cautioned. Corporate interests rarely surrender billions in contracts without deploying every available resource. Let them try, Marcus replied with confidence Frank recognized from his own military career. Some battles are worth fighting regardless of opposition. As they supervised final range clearance operations, Richard Garner approached with two corporate attorneys. His expression suggested strategic recalibration rather than continued confrontation. Colonel Abrams, while today's demonstrations identified areas for potential improvement, I believe we can find constructive paths forward. Garner's corporate demeanor had returned, though noticeably strained. GDT is prepared to implement certain safety modifications while maintaining essential program timelines. Frank recognized the tactical retreat disguised as compromise. All 17 safety modifications are essential, Mr. Garner, not selectively implemented based on cost considerations. That would require significant program restructuring, Garner countered. Schedule extensions, budget increases, potentially reopen competitive bidding. All preferable to dead American soldiers. Garner's professional facade cracked slightly. This isn't over, Colonel. GDT maintains significant support within Pentagon acquisition channels and congressional oversight committees. Understood, Frank replied evenly. But today established objective evidence that cannot be easily dismissed through administrative maneuvering. The facts speak for themselves. As Garner departed, Frank sensed the corporate executive recalibrating strategy rather than accepting decisive defeat. The battle would continue through different channels, but today's testing had created irrefutable documentation that would prove difficult to overcome through political or procedural tactics. General Harrison joined them as testing operations concluded, his expression reflecting professional satisfaction tempered by recognition of continuing challenges. Impressive work today, Frank. Technical demonstration exceeded expectations in establishing safety concerns. GDT isn't conceding defeat, Frank observed. They'll shift battleground to Pentagon acquisition channels and congressional committees. Already happening, Harrison confirmed. Senator Jenkins still plans oversight hearings Monday, now framing them as addressing balance between safety modifications and national security timelines, rather than challenging evaluation legitimacy. Attempting to minimize required modifications through political pressure, Frank concluded. Expected tactical adjustment. The difference is we now have conclusive documentation establishing safety requirements. Harrison appeared cautiously optimistic. Even political allies find defending demonstrably unsafe designs problematic when facing potential public scrutiny. As operations concluded for the day, Frank found Elizabeth Reeves securing final documentation in the control center. Her professional demeanor carried undertones of personal vindication after years building evidence of systematic safety compromises. Testing results exceeded even my expectations, she acknowledged. The ammunition cook-off sequence mirrors exactly what happened to James in Germany. Same design flaw, same catastrophic outcome. Your documentation was essential to comprehensive evaluation, Frank noted. Years of methodical evidence gathering provided foundation for today's demonstration. James would be satisfied, she replied quietly. That's what matters most to me. Frank recognized her comment represented both professional accomplishment and personal closure after years seeking accountability for her husband's death. The Thunderbolt evaluation had become a mechanism for addressing broader pattern of safety compromises extending beyond current program. That evening, Frank gathered his core team at a local restaurant away from Aberdeen's facilities. Marcus, Reeves, Murphy, and Harrison represented the essential perspectives that had enabled successful evaluation despite corporate and political resistance. Today established conclusive evidence of critical safety flaws in the Thunderbolt program, Frank acknowledged. But the larger battle continues through different channels. GDT will deploy every resource available to minimize required modifications and maintain program control regardless of demonstrated safety concerns. Harrison nodded grimly. Congressional hearings Monday represent their primary counterattack. Senator Jenkins will attempt to frame safety modifications as unnecessary delays threatening national security interests. We need our own congressional champions, Reeves suggested. particularly veterans with combat experience who understand crew survivability implications. Already initiated those contacts, Harrison confirmed. Several combat veteran legislators have requested full testing documentation following preliminary reports. Media strategy? Marcus questioned. GDT will attempt to control public narrative through national security framing and economic impact messaging. Frank considered their position strategically. We maintain focus on soldier protection rather than engaging in political messaging. The facts established today speak more powerfully than any public relations campaign. As their discussion continued, Frank observed his son's growing confidence in this unfamiliar battlefield of corporate influence and political maneuvering. Marcus had demonstrated exceptional technical leadership throughout testing while maintaining unwavering commitment to safety principles despite significant career risk. The evening concluded with renewed determination to continue their mission through whatever channels necessary to ensure proper crew protection in the Thunderbolt program. The battle was shifting from technical demonstration to political confrontation, but their core commitment remained unchanged. As Frank returned to his quarters that night, he found message from General Woodward indicating the retired generals had submitted independent assessment supporting comprehensive safety modifications before program continuation. The corporate strategy of deploying former military leaders as counter-influence had backfired when confronted with irrefutable evidence of crew vulnerability. Frank reviewed the day's accomplishments with quiet satisfaction. The technical battle had been decisively won through methodical preparation and objective documentation. The political battle remained, but with significantly stronger position than GDT had anticipated. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as corporate interests deployed their considerable resources to protect billions in contracts regardless of demonstrated safety concerns. But today had established foundation for ultimate victory if they maintained strategic discipline and unwavering commitment to their fundamental mission, protecting American soldiers regardless of political pressure or corporate influence. Morning sunlight streamed through the blinds of Frank's temporary quarters at Aberdeen as he reviewed his notes for the congressional hearing. 3 days had passed since the decisive testing that had exposed critical flaws in the Thunderbolt tank program. 3 days of intense corporate and political maneuvering as GDT attempted to recover from the devastating technical demonstration. Frank had spent decades commanding tanks in combat, but today's battlefield would be a congressional hearing room where different rules applied. The weapons would be words, evidence, and persuasion rather than armor and firepower. Yet the stakes remained the same: American lives. A knock at his door revealed Marcus, already dressed in his Army captain's uniform with meticulous precision. The past week had transformed their relationship from professional formality to genuine respect and renewed family connection. Transportation to Andrews Air Force Base leaves in 30 minutes, Marcus reported. General Harrison is already en route to Washington. Frank nodded, adjusting his tie in the mirror. He had chosen to wear a conservative business suit rather than his uniform. Today he would speak as Frank Abrams, concerned citizen and subject matter expert, rather than Colonel Abrams, decorated combat commander. Testing documentation secured? Frank asked. Triple redundant copies. Dr. Reeves is handling physical evidence transport separately. Marcus hesitated before continuing. GDT's legal team filed supplemental briefings overnight, attempting to restrict what testing footage can be shown during testimony. Frank absorbed this information without surprise. Expected, attempting to control the narrative through procedural limitations. There's more, Marcus added. They've submitted character statements from 3 officers who served under you questioning your objectivity in equipment evaluation. This represented classic corporate tactics when facing damaging technical evidence. Discredit the messenger rather than addressing the message. Frank had anticipated this approach from GDT, but hadn't expected them to recruit former subordinates for the effort. Anyone I know? Major Williams, Captain Rogers, and Lieutenant Parker. Frank nodded slowly. All 3 had disagreed with his conservative approach to equipment adoption during his final command. All 3 had subsequently taken positions with defense contractors after military retirement. The connection wasn't subtle. Doesn't change facts established during testing, Frank stated simply. Let's proceed as planned. The drive to Andrews Air Force Base proceeded in thoughtful silence. Frank mentally prepared for the congressional testimony, while Marcus coordinated final logistics for their presentation. The military transport flight to Washington would provide final opportunity to refine their approach before facing Senator Jenkins and his Armed Services Subcommittee. As they boarded the aircraft, Frank was surprised to find Sergeant Murphy already seated inside, dressed in a well-worn but perfectly pressed suit that seemed uncomfortable on his rugged frame. "Sergeant, didn't expect to see you here." Murphy grinned. General Harrison thought the committee might benefit from enlisted perspective on crew survivability. Can't have just officers and executives talking about what happens inside a burning tank. Frank nodded appreciatively. Murphy's combat experience as a tank gunner would provide powerful testimony that corporate executives couldn't easily dismiss. The sergeant's authentic perspective might resonate with committee members in ways technical specifications couldn't match. "Glad to have you aboard. Your practical experience will be valuable." As the aircraft lifted off, Dr. Elizabeth Reeves joined their strategy session. Her professional demeanor remained intact, but Frank noted increasing determination in her expression as their mission approached culmination. "GDT's damage control is accelerating," she reported, opening her laptop to display news coverage. "They've launched a coordinated media campaign emphasizing national security implications of program delays. 3 retired generals gave interviews this morning, claiming safety concerns are exaggerated and being exploited by modernization opponents." Frank reviewed the coverage without surprise. Standard approach: frame safety modifications as unnecessary obstacles to national security rather than essential crew protection. Senator Jenkins has expanded hearing participation to include Defense Department acquisition officials known to favor accelerated procurement timelines, Reeves continued. They'll likely emphasize strategic competition with foreign adversaries rather than addressing specific safety concerns. The corporate counterattack was unfolding exactly as Frank had anticipated. GDT couldn't directly challenge the devastating technical evidence established during testing, so they were attempting to change evaluation criteria from crew safety to strategic urgency and economic impact. "Our approach remains unchanged," Frank decided. "Focus exclusively on established safety vulnerabilities and required modifications to protect American soldiers. Let others debate strategic timelines and budget implications." Marcus nodded in agreement. "The 17 specific safety modifications we've documented represent our strongest position. Each addresses demonstrable battlefield vulnerabilities with clear life-saving implications." As they continued refining their presentation, Frank received a call from General Harrison already in Washington. The general's voice carried unusual tension even through the secure military line. "Frank, situation has evolved significantly overnight. GDT has mobilized impressive political resources." Harrison lowered his voice despite the secure connection. "Secretary is receiving direct pressure from White House regarding program delays affecting battle group readiness planning. National security card being played at highest levels," Frank observed. "Expected escalation." "There's more," Harrison continued. "Senator Jenkins has restructured today's hearing format. Technical testimony limited to 15 minutes per witness. No video evidence permitted, only written documentation." The procedural manipulation represented classic tactics to minimize impact of damaging evidence. By restricting presentation format and duration, GDT's congressional allies were attempting to dilute the power of the testing results that had so conclusively demonstrated safety failures. "Doesn't change our approach," Frank replied. "Core facts remain regardless of presentation limitations." After ending the call, Frank briefed his team on the evolving situation. Rather than discouragement, the news of intensified corporate resistance seemed to strengthen their collective determination. "They're running scared," Murphy observed with veterans' insight. "All this maneuvering means they know the facts aren't on their side." "Procedural obstruction indicates fear of substantive discussion," Reeves agreed. "Classic defensive tactics when facing indefensible technical position." The flight landed at Andrews, where government vehicles awaited to transport them to Capitol Hill. The Senate Armed Services Committee hearing room buzzed with activity as they arrived. Staffers arranged materials while technicians adjusted audio systems. Television cameras positioned strategically indicated public broadcast of proceedings, despite GDT's reported attempts to limit media coverage. Richard Garner sat surrounded by corporate executives and attorneys at one witness table, his expression conveying confident corporate composure restored after the testing setback. The GDT contingent projected unified corporate strength through matching dark suits and coordinated materials. Senator James Jenkins entered with committee members, his practiced political demeanor revealing nothing of his reported alignment with GDT interests. As committee chairman, he would control hearing flow, question sequence, and speaking time allocation. The procedural advantages favored GDT's strategy of minimizing technical testimony while emphasizing strategic and economic considerations. The hearing began with Chairman Jenkins establishing parameters that confirmed Harrison's warning. Technical testimony would indeed be restricted to 15 minutes per witness, with no visual presentations permitted. The format heavily favored GDT's narrative approach over detailed safety evidence. Today's hearing addresses concerns regarding the M7 Thunderbolt next-generation combat system development timeline. Jenkins began with practice political neutrality. Specifically, we will examine whether recent testing protocols applied appropriate standards consistent with program objectives and national security requirements. The framing attempted to shift focus from safety concerns to testing methodology, exactly as Frank had anticipated. Rather than addressing whether the Thunderbolt was dangerously flawed, Jenkins sought to question whether testing had been fairly administered. Richard Garner testified first, his corporate polish on full display as he characterized the Thunderbolt as revolutionary advancement in armored warfare capabilities essential to maintaining American battlefield dominance in contested environments. Global defense technologies remains fully committed to soldier safety as our highest priority, Garner stated with practiced sincerity. Recent testing highlighted potential refinement opportunities that can be addressed through targeted modifications without compromising essential program timelines critical to national security objectives. The testimony carefully minimized catastrophic safety failures as refinement opportunities while emphasizing strategic urgency. Several committee members nodded appreciatively at the national security framing, particularly those representing districts with GDT manufacturing facilities. Frank observed the political theater with combat veterans detachment. The corporate messaging was professionally executed but fundamentally dishonest in characterizing test results. His responsibility remained clear, presenting unvarnished truth regardless of political receptiveness. When called to testify, Frank approached the witness table with the same steady confidence he had once carried into combat. His opening statement went directly to core safety concerns without political prelude or corporate cushioning. The M7 Thunderbolt, as currently designed, contains 17 critical safety deficiencies that place American soldiers at unacceptable risk, Frank began bluntly. Testing conclusively demonstrated catastrophic crew survivability failures under combat realistic conditions that would result in unnecessary American casualties on the battlefield. Several committee members shifted uncomfortably at the stark assessment. Frank continued methodically, detailing specific safety failures documented during testing despite the limited time allocation. He focused particularly on ammunition storage configuration that mirrored the exact design flaw responsible for tank crew deaths in previous conflicts. The fundamental question before this committee isn't program timelines or budget implications, Frank continued with unwavering conviction. It's whether we will knowingly deploy American soldiers in vehicles with demonstrated catastrophic safety failures that could be addressed through appropriate modifications. As Frank's allocated time neared conclusion, Senator Jenkins interrupted with practiced parliamentary precision. Colonel Abrams, while we appreciate your passionate advocacy, this committee must consider comprehensive national security implications beyond specific technical concerns. With respect, Senator, dead American soldiers contribute nothing to national security, Frank replied evenly. Every safety modification we've identified addresses specific battlefield vulnerabilities, conclusively demonstrated through objective testing. The exchange captured the fundamental conflict underlying the entire proceedings. Corporate and political interests emphasized strategic timelines and budget considerations, while Frank maintained singular focus on soldier protection, regardless of program implications. Marcus testified next, providing engineering perspective on required modifications with exceptional technical clarity despite time constraints. His presentation effectively established that safety improvements could be implemented without compromising essential performance capabilities if appropriate program adjustments were permitted. The fundamental engineering compromises occurred when proven safety systems were eliminated to reduce production costs and accelerate program timelines, Marcus explained. Restoring those systems requires program adjustment but enhances rather than compromises combat effectiveness by ensuring crew survivability under battlefield conditions. Senator Jenkins appeared increasingly frustrated as technical testimony repeatedly returned to catastrophic safety failures rather than schedule and budget considerations. His questioning became more pointed, particularly when addressing timeline implications of comprehensive modifications. Captain Abrams, wouldn't these extensive modifications delay fielding by potentially years, creating dangerous capability gaps against peer adversaries? Jenkins challenged. Senator, no capability gap is more dangerous than deploying vehicles that could kill their own crews through preventable design flaws. Marcus responded with professional conviction that made Frank immensely proud. We cannot address peer threats with vehicles our soldiers cannot survive operating. The morning session continued with testimony from Pentagon acquisition officials, predictably emphasizing strategic urgency and program timelines over specific safety concerns. The bureaucratic perspective prioritized procurement schedules over technical modifications despite acknowledged safety implications. During the lunch recess, Frank gathered his team to assess proceedings and adjust approach for afternoon testimony. Despite procedural limitations, they had established clear documentation of safety deficiencies that even political allies would find difficult dismissing completely. GDT is shifting strategy toward partial modifications rather than comprehensive redesign, Frank observed. They'll likely propose addressing 3 or 4 highest visibility issues while deferring others to future upgrades. Classic corporate compromise when facing indefensible technical position, Reeves confirmed. Acknowledge minimum necessary concerns while preserving program control and profit margins. Their assessment proved accurate when proceedings resumed. Richard Garner announced GDT's Proactive Safety Enhancement Initiative, addressing 4 specific issues identified during testing while maintaining program timelines. The proposal represented carefully calibrated corporate response, acknowledging minimum necessary modifications while preserving essential program structure. Senator Jenkins embraced the compromise approach enthusiastically, characterizing it as responsible balance between safety considerations and national security imperatives. Several committee members nodded appreciatively at the apparent resolution that protected both corporate and political interests. When Murphy's turn to testify arrived, the veteran sergeant brought unexpected emotional impact that technical presentations couldn't match. His authentic perspective as tank crewman who had experienced combat system failures provided powerful counterpoint to corporate and political messaging. Senators, I pulled burned crewmen from tanks after ammunition fires, Murphy stated with blunt authenticity that commanded attention despite his lack of rank or title. Watched good soldiers die because safety systems failed under combat conditions. That's not statistical probability or acquisition timeline. That's American boys coming home in body bags because someone decided budget efficiencies mattered more than their lives. The testimony shifted hearing atmosphere noticeably. Murphy's genuine combat perspective couldn't be easily dismissed as theoretical concern or professional disagreement. His description of actual casualties resulting from similar design compromises created emotional impact that technical specifications couldn't match. When Dr. Reeves testified regarding specific failure modes documented during testing, she methodically connected current design flaws to historical casualties, including her husband's death in Germany. Her testimony established a pattern of systematic safety compromises spanning multiple programs and decades, rather than isolated concerns with current development. The ammunition storage configuration in the Thunderbolt represents identical design compromise that killed my husband and his crew, Reeves stated with professional precision, carrying profound personal impact. Not similar or comparable, identical, despite 20 years of documented casualties resulting from precisely this design approach. The combined testimony created compelling case for comprehensive safety modifications despite procedural limitations and time constraints. Even committee members previously aligned with GDT position appeared increasingly uncomfortable, defending demonstrable safety compromises with clear life-threatening implications. As formal testimony concluded, Senator Jenkins attempted to frame proceedings toward predetermined compromise outcome. Today's hearing has provided valuable perspective on balancing essential program advancement with appropriate safety considerations. GDT's proactive modifications appear to address primary concerns while maintaining critical national security timelines. The carefully constructed narrative suggested reasonable resolution had been achieved through corporate responsiveness rather than acknowledging fundamental design failures requiring comprehensive redesign. The political framing protected both corporate interests and congressional oversight credibility while providing superficial acknowledgement of safety concerns. Frank recognized the attempted narrative closure, but remained unwavering in his assessment. During closing remarks, he directly challenged the compromise characterization with combat leaders' clarity. Respectfully, Senator, addressing 4 of 17 documented safety failures leaves American soldiers unnecessarily vulnerable to preventable battlefield casualties, Frank stated firmly. Partial modifications represent continued prioritization of program timelines over soldier survivability. That compromise may satisfy procurement schedules, but will ultimately cost American lives. The blunt assessment visibly disturbed several committee members who preferred the comfortable corporate compromise narrative. Senator Jenkins appeared particularly displeased with Frank's unwillingness to accept the politically expedient resolution. Colonel Abrams, while your dedication to safety is commendable, practical program management requires reasonable compromise balancing multiple national priorities. Jenkins responded with practiced political deflection. GDT's responsive modifications represent appropriate balance that this committee finds generally satisfactory. The exchange crystallized fundamental conflict between political expediency and moral clarity that had characterized the entire Thunderbolt evaluation. Corporate and political interests sought compromise that preserved program structure and financial arrangements while acknowledging minimum necessary safety concerns. Frank maintained unwavering commitment to comprehensive soldier protection, regardless of program implications. As formal proceedings concluded, Richard Garner approached Frank with corporate confidence restored by apparent political alignment. Colonel, I believe today's hearing demonstrated reasonable path forward addressing legitimate concerns while maintaining essential program integrity. GDT remains committed to constructive resolution, benefiting all stakeholders. Partial modifications leave American soldiers unnecessarily vulnerable, Mr. Garner, Frank replied directly. That's not resolution, it's continued prioritization of corporate interests over soldier survivability. Garner's expression hardened slightly beneath his corporate facade. The committee appears satisfied with our responsive approach, Colonel. Sometimes perfect becomes enemy of good enough in complex program management. There's no good enough when it comes to preventable American casualties, Mr. Garner. Frank maintained unwavering focus on fundamental principle that had guided his entire military career. Either we protect our soldiers properly or we don't. There's no acceptable middle ground. As Garner departed, Frank gathered his team to assess their position following congressional testimony. Despite procedural limitations and political alignment with the corporate interests, they had established clear documentation of safety deficiencies that couldn't be easily dismissed despite attempted narrative framing. Jenkins will issue committee findings supporting GDT's partial modifications approach, Frank assessed realistically. Political alignment with corporate interests remains intact despite technical evidence. So we failed, Murphy concluded with veteran's bluntness. Not necessarily, Marcus interjected, displaying strategic thinking that made Frank increasingly proud of his son's professional development. Committee findings influence but don't control program requirements. Pentagon authorization still governs actual production specifications. And public opinion matters to politicians even more than corporate donations, Reeves added thoughtfully, especially regarding soldier safety. Their contemplation was interrupted by unexpected approach from Senator Michael Coleman, a committee member who had remained largely silent during formal proceedings. The senator's military bearings suggested service background that his political biography confirmed as Army infantry officer during Operation Desert Storm. Colonel Abrams, might I have a word privately? Coleman requested with professional courtesy that transcended political positioning. Frank followed the senator to a quiet alcove away from hearing participants. Coleman's expression suggested genuine concern rather than political calculation. That was quite a performance in there, Coleman began, studying Frank carefully. Most witnesses accept political reality and adjust testimony accordingly. You maintained unwavering position despite obvious committee direction. Safety isn't political, Senator. It's moral obligation to soldiers who trust equipment with their lives. Coleman nodded slowly, seeming to reach decision after internal deliberation. You don't recognize me, do you, Colonel? Frank studied the senator more carefully, searching for connection he might have missed previously. Something about the man seemed vaguely familiar beyond his public persona, but specific recognition remained elusive. February 26, 1991, 70 miles into Iraq near Basra, Coleman continued quietly. Mechanized infantry company ambushed during sandstorm. Command vehicle disabled. Communications compromised. Unit verging on disintegration under heavy fire. The specific details triggered immediate combat memory that Frank had filed away among thousands of battlefield encounters across multiple deployments. Republican Guard counterattack during northern flanking maneuver. Your company was separated from battalion during limited visibility navigation. Coleman nodded, emotion briefly visible beneath his political composure. Tank commander diverted from primary mission to extract infantry, despite tactical directive prioritizing forward momentum. Held position under artillery fire while loading wounded. Provided covering fire during extraction, despite mission timeline implications. The memory crystallized completely in Frank's consciousness. Coleman had been young infantry lieutenant whose unit faced annihilation after becoming separated during massive coalition advance toward Basra. Frank had diverted his tank company to extract the infantry despite orders prioritizing forward momentum toward primary objectives. You were that lieutenant, Frank realized, connecting military past with political present across 3 decades separation. Newly commissioned, first combat deployment, completely overwhelmed and facing unit destruction, Coleman confirmed quietly. Your tanks appeared through sandstorm like divine intervention. You personally directed loading wounded onto your vehicle while maintaining radio discipline with battalion commander who was ordering immediate return to primary mission. Tactical necessity, Frank responded automatically, uncomfortable with characterization suggesting extraordinary action rather than basic leadership responsibility. You told battalion commander mission parameters adjusted based on battlefield conditions when he demanded immediate resumption of advance. Coleman continued with perfect recall of significant life moment, then added Americans don't leave Americans under fire when he persisted. Frank remembered the exchange clearly, though hadn't considered it particularly noteworthy among countless battlefield decisions across multiple deployments. Standard combat leadership, prioritizing soldier welfare above abstract mission parameters when circumstances required adjustment. Your intervention saved 27 lives that day, including mine, Coleman stated with quiet intensity, transcending political persona. I've never forgotten watching you stand exposed in turret directing casualty evacuation while taking fire from 3 directions. The connection across decades created unexpected context for their current interaction. Coleman hadn't been merely silent committee member observing political theater, but direct beneficiary of Frank's combat leadership principles now being applied to Thunderbolt safety evaluation. What happens next with Thunderbolt program? Frank asked directly, recognizing Coleman's committee position potentially offered insight beyond public proceedings. Jenkins will issue findings supporting GDT's partial modifications approach. Political and financial alignment too established for different outcome. Coleman's assessment matched Frank's own conclusion regarding formal proceedings. But committee findings aren't final determination. Meaning? Meaning formal report represents initial position rather than conclusive resolution, Coleman explained with insiders' understanding of Washington process. Authorizing legislation remains separate procedural track with different approval requirements and multiple influence points. Frank considered implications of procedural separation between committee findings and actual program authorization. Pentagon procurement authorization still governs production specifications regardless of committee recommendations. Precisely, and Secretary maintains certification authority regarding operational readiness regardless of political pressure. Coleman's expression suggested strategic possibility beyond apparent corporate victory. Technical safety certification requires separate authorization chain that political influence cannot easily override without documented justification. The procedural insight offered potential pathway forward despite committee alignment with corporate interests. If technical safety certification could be separated from political oversight, objective evidence might still govern final program requirements regardless of committee findings. Why tell me this, Senator? Frank asked directly. Because Americans don't leave Americans under fire, Coleman replied simply, echoing Frank's statement from 3 decades earlier. Some debts transcend political calculation. As Coleman departed, Frank rejoined his team with renewed strategic perspective. The congressional hearing had unfolded largely as anticipated, with political alignment supporting corporate interests despite compelling safety evidence. Yet procedural separation between committee findings and actual program authorization offered potential pathway forward if properly leveraged. We adjust approach based on battlefield conditions, Frank explained, outlining revised strategy incorporating Coleman's procedural insights. Committee findings influence but don't control technical certification requirements. Pentagon authorization still governs actual production specifications regardless of political posturing. Marcus grasped implications immediately. Technical safety certification requires separate authorization through military channels rather than congressional oversight. If Secretary maintains certification authority based on objective testing rather than political recommendation, then comprehensive safety modifications could still be required despite committee findings supporting partial approach, Reeves concluded, professional demeanor brightening with renewed possibility. Their strategic recalibration was interrupted by General Harrison's arrival, his expression suggesting significant developments beyond public proceedings. Frank, we need to talk privately. Situation has evolved substantially at Pentagon. In secluded conference room away from media presence, Harrison revealed unexpected development that transformed their strategic position entirely. Secretary reviewed complete testing documentation personally last night, was particularly affected by ammunition compartment failure sequence and thermal propagation into crew positions. His Desert Storm experience, Frank noted, recalling Harrison's earlier comment about Secretary losing friends to equipment failures during that conflict. Exactly, this morning he contacted White House directly regarding Thunderbolt safety certification requirements. Harrison's professional demeanor couldn't completely conceal satisfaction at this development. Informed President that he cannot in good conscience certify current design as combat ready regardless of congressional or corporate pressure. The Secretary's direct intervention represented potential transformation of entire program trajectory despite apparent corporate victory in congressional proceedings. As civilian head of military establishment, his certification authority regarding combat readiness transcended both corporate influence and political pressure from legislative branch. His specific directive? Frank asked, focusing on practical implications rather than procedural positioning. Comprehensive safety review with required certification that all 17 identified vulnerabilities have been properly addressed before production authorization. Harrison confirmed with unmistakable satisfaction. No partial modifications or phased implementation. Complete resolution required for program continuation. The directive effectively overrode committee findings supporting GDT's partial modifications approach. While congressional oversight maintained budget authority, the Secretary's certification requirement regarding combat readiness created non-negotiable technical standard that political influence couldn't easily circumvent. GDT's response? Currently in damage control mode, attempting to leverage congressional allies for pressure campaign against Secretary. Harrison appeared unconcerned about corporate counterattack. Unlike committee members, Secretary has no re-election concerns or campaign financing considerations. His obligation to soldiers transcends political calculation. Frank absorbed these developments with cautious optimism. The Secretary's intervention created potential pathway toward comprehensive safety modifications despite corporate resistance and political alignment. Yet experience suggested GDT would deploy every available resource protecting billions in contracts regardless of certification requirements. Next steps, Frank asked, focusing on practical implementation rather than procedural victory. Secretary has authorized formation of dedicated safety certification team with independent oversight authority regarding modification implementation, Harrison explained. He specifically requested your leadership of this effort, Frank. The assignment represented both professional recognition and personal vindication after confronting formidable corporate and political resistance. Frank considered implications carefully before responding. Time commitment, minimum 18 months for proper implementation and verification, potentially longer depending on engineering complexity. Harrison recognized the significant commitment being requested beyond Frank's temporary evaluation role. Understand if retirement priorities preclude acceptance. Frank didn't hesitate in his response. Retirement continues indefinitely. Proper soldier protection takes priority over personal considerations. Harrison nodded with evident satisfaction. Thought you might say that. Secretary anticipated your response and authorized appropriate position creation within Pentagon oversight structure. Full colonel reactivation with direct reporting authority to his office. As they discussed implementation details, Frank recognized opportunity to rebuild not just proper tank design, but procurement system that prioritized soldier welfare above corporate profit and political expediency. The Thunderbolt program could establish precedent affecting future generations of military equipment beyond current controversy. Their discussion was interrupted by Marcus arriving with breaking news affecting their strategic position. GDT stock dropped 17% in afternoon trading following rumors of certification issues. Board called emergency session regarding program viability under enhanced safety requirements. The financial implications created additional leverage beyond technical certification. Corporate resistance typically softened considerably when shareholder value declined significantly, creating internal pressure toward resolution that external requirements alone might not generate. Perfect, Harrison observed with professional satisfaction. Financial pressure often accomplishes what moral argument cannot when dealing with corporate interests. As day concluded, Frank gathered his core team for final assessment before departing Washington. The congressional hearing had unfolded largely as anticipated, with political alignment supporting corporate interests despite compelling safety evidence. Yet unexpected developments had transformed their strategic position through separate certification requirements that transcended committee findings. Secretary's intervention changes fundamental program trajectory regardless of congressional posturing, Frank explained. Technical certification requirements cannot be easily circumvented through political channels without documented justification no one wants to provide. Meaning comprehensive safety modifications become essentially mandatory despite committee support for partial approach, Marcus concluded with evident satisfaction. GDT must either implement full requirements or abandon program entirely. And financial pressure from stock decline creates internal corporate incentive toward resolution rather than continued resistance, Reeves added with professional assessment transcending personal vindication. Shareholders typically prefer modified program over abandoned investment. Murphy summarized their position with veterans' blunt clarity. Means the good guys won despite political theater suggesting otherwise. Frank considered this characterization with combat leaders' perspective that transcended simplistic victory narratives. Means American soldiers will receive properly protected equipment regardless of corporate profit margins or political positioning. That's the only outcome that truly matters. As they prepared to depart Washington, Frank found himself alone briefly with his son. The professional collaboration of past weeks had gradually restored personal connection, damaged through years of distance. Their shared commitment to soldier welfare, despite significant personal risk, had rebuilt foundation for relationship transcending professional interaction. The Secretary has requested my leadership of safety certification team, Frank revealed. Minimum 18-month commitment overseeing modification implementation. Marcus appeared momentarily surprised by this development. Retirement on hold indefinitely? Some missions transcend personal priorities, Frank replied simply. Proper soldier protection takes precedence over retirement plans. Marcus nodded with understanding that reflected shared values despite different professional expressions. The Abrams tradition continues. Indeed it does. Frank studied his son with newfound appreciation for professional integrity that had guided his actions throughout Thunderbolt evaluation despite significant career risk. The Secretary also requested specific technical leadership for modification implementation team. If your current commanding officer approves temporary reassignment. Marcus appeared genuinely surprised by this development. My involvement created significant tension with GDT leadership, potentially career-limiting for future program participation. Precisely why Secretary requested you specifically, Frank explained with evident pride in his son's principled stand despite personal consequences. Demonstrated willingness to prioritize soldier welfare above career advancement represents exactly the leadership integrity this program requires moving forward. The assignment opportunity created potential for continued collaboration beyond current evaluation. Father and son working together professionally to implement safety systems they had fought to require despite corporate and political resistance. The prospect carried significance transcending professional assignment. 18 months minimum commitment, Marcus noted, considering implications carefully. Potentially career-altering depending on corporate reaction to required modifications. Some fights are worth having, regardless of career implications, Frank observed, echoing principle that had guided his own military service through multiple conflicts and commands. Your mother would be immensely proud of your choices these past weeks. The reference to Catherine Abrams created emotional resonance beyond professional consideration. Her influence remained powerful guiding force for both men despite her absence. Her unwavering commitment to integrity above expediency had shaped their personal and professional values in ways that continued guiding their choices. She always said Abrams' men were stubborn when principles were at stake, Marcus recalled, with genuine smile transcending professional demeanor. Called it both our greatest strength and occasional limitation. She wasn't wrong, Frank acknowledged, memories of his late wife momentarily vivid despite years separation. She also believed doing what's right matters more than doing what's expedient. Principle you've demonstrated conclusively these past weeks. Their moment of personal connection was interrupted by notification that transportation awaited for return journey to Aberdeen. The congressional hearing had concluded, but their mission continued through implementation phase that would ultimately determine whether American soldiers received properly protected equipment, regardless of corporate and political positioning. As they departed Washington, Frank reflected on a journey that had begun with museum tour guiding fellow veterans through armor history and evolved into consequential battle for proper soldier protection transcending single weapons program. The Thunderbolt evaluation had become a mechanism for addressing systematic procurement failures, prioritizing corporate profit and political expediency above battlefield survivability. More importantly, the mission had rebuilt connection with his son that professional distance and personal grief had damaged over years' separation. Their shared commitment to soldier welfare, despite significant personal risk, had restored foundation for relationship transcending professional collaboration. Whatever challenges implementation phase presented, they would face them together with renewed family connection, reinforcing professional partnership. The Abrams legacy continued through different expression, but identical commitment to fundamental principle that had guided their family through 4 generations of military service, protecting American soldiers regardless of personal consequences, standing ground when principles mattered despite powerful opposition, doing what's right rather than what's expedient when lives depended on their decisions. Some traditions were worth preserving across generations, regardless of changing battlefields or weapons systems. The Abrams tradition of unwavering integrity when American lives hung in balance represented a legacy more important than any tank bearing their family name. A legacy of steel, in machines they commanded, in principles they upheld, in family bonds that endured.